Hi, good evening, everyone. Welcome to our 15th in the series of webinars brought to you by Vash Associates. Today's topic will be around compliances in debt funding. Our panelists today are Ms. Sandhya Iyer, who is a partner in the Mumbai office. Her practice areas are primarily banking, finance, M&A, and insolvency law. We also have our colleagues, Mr. Atul Singh and Mr. Shehbaz Ali Fazilboy, who are both associates in the corporate practice in the Bombay office. I'm Srinivas Shankaran, a principal associate in the corporate practice in the Mumbai office. Unlike equity, debt investment provide investors downside protection, guaranteed returns, and security against the money advanced. In the last couple of decades, several alternative means to bank lending have also emerged to cover for the debt requirements of Indian companies. With RBI today pushing for more and more banks to lend freely to companies to revive flagging growth and to cushion the impact of COVID-19, the importance of debt funding assumes more and more significance today. So in today's webinar, what we will do is we will examine some of the most common and popular forms of debt financing and the broad compliances that are required in each of these cases. I'll now hand over the mic to my colleague Sandhya Iyer, who will discuss various things to be borne in mind around plain vanilla loans, factoring, commercial paper, leasing, hire purchase. Over to you, Sandhya.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. The first topic that I would be speaking about is plain vanilla loans. So firstly, the distinction, I would like to bring out the distinction between working capital and term loans. So working capital facility is required by any business to meet its operational requirements, like for example, purchase of raw materials, payment to workmen and employees, and electricity dues and other overheads. And term lending is basically required by businesses to meet all their capital expenditure, like purchase of plant and machinery, etc. The golden thumb rule for borrowing is never use short-term funding for long-term uses. And we have seen over the years how there have been several companies who have diverted working capital facilities for long-term uses like capex and have got into very serious liquidity problems and defaults. In fact, RBI's willful defaulter circular specifies that if funds, that is disbursements, are utilized, that is short-term working capital funds are utilized for long-term purposes contrary to the terms of sanction, it amounts to diversion of funds and you can be treated even as a willful defaulter. So in the case of the loan products that we will be discussing today, NCDs may be used for working capital or they may be used for term loans. Shehbaz will be covering the limited circumstances under which ECBs can be used for working capital facility. Otherwise, normally ECBs are used only for capex, that is, it's a kind of term loan. And leasing and hire purchase is always for capex. ICDs is mostly for working capital, but it may be used as a bridge finance sometimes. And factoring and commercial paper are always used only for working capital. Now, in India, there has been a very long tradition, and it's a very logical tradition and practice that for term lenders, there is a first charge on the fixed assets of the business, and there is a second charge on current assets of the business. And for working capital lenders, it's the other way around. The working capital lenders have a first charge on the current assets of the business and a second charge on the fixed assets of the business. So this does not flow from any law, but this is just a practice that has emerged over the years. Now, as far as plain vanilla loans go, they are taken from banks, NBFCs, financial institutions, private lenders, and loans from banks, NBFCs, and financial institutions, documentation tends to be very bulky. But private lenders normally prefer briefer documents, and the documents are generally simpler. In any loan, what are the most important aspects that one has to take care of in a documentation? The amount of the loan, the rate of interest, what is the date of repayment, prepayment provisions, what is the default interest, what are the event of default triggers, what are the consequences of event of default, what are positive covenants, what are negative covenants. So these are some of the main aspects that we cover in any loan transaction. And many a time lenders have come to us and told us that, no, we don't want this 40-page, 100-page and 200-page document. Just make us a simple 5 to 10-page document. And we've managed to cover most of these aspects even in simple documentation in case of private loans. Now, one of the traditional features of loans is that normally when you lend money, you expect the borrower to bring in a margin of say 10 to 25% to be brought in by the borrower. However, in these times, it's not unusual to see 100% funding also, but traditionally, plain vanilla loans, there is always a requirement of a margin. Now, coming to the PPT presentation, I'll move on from plain vanilla loans to factoring. So, if you can just move to, yeah, so the slide, I think I need the next slide. So, can you just move to the next slide? Parth, can you, am I audible?
Yes, ma'am, I think there's some technical glitch. I'll just solve it.
Yeah, just sort it out and just move to the second slide. Or maybe you can project it on your screen.
Are you able to see?
I am not able to, I'm able to see the slide, but it's not moving down.
Okay.
Srinivasa, try it out now.
Yeah. Okay. Are you able to see?
Yeah, I can see it now, but just move to the factoring slide. Okay, fine. But is the font very, very small?
No, it's readable.
It's readable. Okay, fine. So the first product that I'm going to speak about is factoring. And factoring is a form of receivables financing, which is governed by the Factoring Act 2011. So what is factoring? Let me explain it by way of a simple example. So let us take the example of a packaging company. The name of the company is Packaging Company Limited, and it is engaged in supplying packaging material to many large and small FMCG companies. And once they sell their packaging material to the FMCG companies pay after 90 days. That is the credit period that is allowed is 90 days. So now factoring was originally, so in the meanwhile, when it has sold the products, the packaging company needs money to manage its day-to-day operations. So factoring was originally conceived as receivables management. Any business, whether you are engaged in sale of goods or services, so you do not like to waste your time on chasing debtors, and any entrepreneur would prefer to spend their time on developing their business and on their operational activities rather than chasing debtors. And this is where a factor is supposed to step in and manage the entire debts of the business. So originally, as factoring has been conceived, what a factor is supposed to do is, suppose packaging company has sold its goods to various FMCG, it hands over, it says, okay, these are my list of debtors and these are the amounts due from them. And the factor manages the entire receivables, bookkeeping, chasing the debtors, recovering them, managing the accounts and everything. And factor will get a fee for this service. Now, if the factor also buys the debt from packaging company, then it is a type of financing and the factor would also earn interest as well. However, in today's market, the factoring that we see is more of a pure financing rather than receivables management. Today, if you see, factors accept only debtors who are very highly rated. So if we take the example of packaging company, then if it goes to a factor for a factoring line of credit, then what happens is the factor will, I mean, the FMC, there are several FMCG companies who are buying the goods of the factor. So what happens is the factor, goods of the packaging company. So the factor will choose only those FMCG company debtors who are highly rated, and the FMCG companies or the debtors who are not very highly rated will not be financed under this factoring arrangement. That's what we are generally seeing in practice. So what happens here is when this packaging company has debts due from FMCG company, the packaging company assigns these debts to the factor, and this could be with recourse or without recourse. Quite often we see that it is without recourse, and on the due date, when it is assigned, the value of these debts minus a discount is paid by the factor to packaging company. So packaging company, before 90 days itself, it gets its full amount. And at the end of expiry of 90 days, the factor will, the debtor will have to repay to the factor, and the factor recovers the money. So if the debtor defaults, the risk is on the factor. Now, there is a possibility that sometimes the packaging company has supplied substandard or deficient goods to the FMCG companies, and the FMCG companies refuses to pay. So many a time there will be a limited recourse, and the factor will say that if the FMCG company does not repay on account of deficient product or quality of goods not being up to the mark, then in that case I have recourse to the packaging company. So this would be limited recourse. And so what we would like to see, if you see this is a pure financing model, what we would like to see factoring evolving into is genuine receivables management. So if these factoring companies take over the entire receivables, like for example, you see in car finance, two-wheeler finance, that there are specialist recovery agents. So if factors can develop this area and help SMEs to recover their loans, then it would be very useful for SMEs who can concentrate on developing the business and don't have to waste their time over recoveries of their receivables. Coming back to factoring, as I said, factoring is governed by the Factoring Act 2011, and the factoring is defined in the Factoring Act as factoring business means the business of acquisition of receivables of the assigner by accepting assignment of such receivables, which I've already explained, or it could also be financing by way of loans or advances against security interest over receivables. So financing is also treated as factoring under the Factoring Act. And if a factor is to engage in factoring business, it must be registered with RBI, and they are called NBFC factors. But banks are exempt from registration. Banks can carry on or engage in factoring business without registration with RBI because they are already licensed. One important thing in this Factoring Act that we must know is, now suppose this packaging company, before availing of factoring credit, it has existing lenders and it has created a charge over present and future receivables in favor of its existing lenders, and then it decides to assign some of the receivables to a factor. If the packaging company informs the factor that yes, there is an existing lender who has a charge over these receivables I'm assigning to you, then the factor, when they are disbursing the money, they should not pay the full amount to the packaging company, but they will have to satisfy the dues of the existing lender. So that is provided in the Factoring Act. Now, apart from this, other important things which are provided in the Factoring Act is regarding notice of assignment. So what happens? Factoring Act clearly provides that once the packaging company has assigned the loan to the factor, it may or may not give the notice of assignment to the debtor. So once the notice of assignment is given to the debtor has to make future payments to the assignee, who's the factor, and the debtor will get discharged for payments only if they have made payment to the factors. Now, there is also a possibility that nobody has given notice of assignment to the debtor and the debtor continues to make payments to the assigner because the debtor is not aware of the assignment. In that case, the Act provides that whatever the debtor pays to the assigner has to be held in trust by the assigner and promptly passed on back to the factor. So all these modalities are clearly specified in the Factoring Act, and the Factoring Act is quite useful. Another important provision of the Factoring Act is it says that whenever any of these factoring assignment of receivables takes place, they have to be registered with CERSAI within 30 days from the date of assignment. Similarly, when there is a satisfaction also has to be filed with CERSAI. And another important thing about factoring is there is Section 8D of the Indian Stamp Act, which has been introduced, which exempts deed of assignment in favor of factors from stamp duty. But this is applicable only to those states who have adopted the Indian Stamp Act. For other states, you have to follow, you'll have to find out what is the prevailing stamp duty under the local laws. Now, just to speak about documentation required for factoring, it is quite simple. It's basically a deed of, most of the time it will be just a deed of assignment and maybe a sanction letter setting out the modalities or the way in which factoring is going to be done. Now compare this to documentation for NCDs, ECBs, and to some extent even leasing and hire purchase. They tend to be a little bulky with multiple documentations. So documentation for factoring is relatively simpler, and documentation, of course, for commercial paper, factoring, ICDs, all tend to be simple. And in ICDs, in fact, you may even make do with a simple demand promissory note, which in my view is the simplest and the most effective document. So next slide. So coming to the next product, which is commercial paper. So let me give you this background of commercial paper again with a slight example. So this packaging company wants to raise short-term working capital facilities from some investors by way of commercial paper. So what will the packaging company do? It will issue an unsecured money market instrument to an investor, and this is in the form of a promissory note. So this basic document, commercial paper, is the promissory note. I promise to pay so-and-so amount on so-and-so date with so-and-so interest, whatever it is. And these instruments are held in demat form. And once this promissory note is issued, the investor in turn will lend money to the packaging company. And the tenor of this commercial paper is anywhere between 7 days to 1 year. So these are short-term instruments. So who are the people who are issuers and can raise money by way of commercial paper? Most popular, which we see very often, is the companies and NBFCs. Is seen very often, but even notified financial institutions, some entities with capital of more than net worth of more than 100 crores are also permitted to issue commercial paper. Coming to the conditions of issue, so one of the important conditions is if this company, that is say packaging company, wants to issue commercial or raise money by way of commercial paper, then it should not have, that is all its fund-based facility availed from banks and financial institutions should be classified as a standard asset, that is they should not be a non-performing asset. So the next question is, who can be investors or the lenders, what we would call the lenders? It's not only the investor in commercial paper, they are any resident or non-resident can be an investor in a commercial paper, but you cannot invest in the commercial paper issued by a related party. Next slide. Okay, so the next topic is buyback. This packaging company, though the tenor is 7 days to 1 year, packaging company can also buy back the commercial paper on or after 30 days from the date of issue at the prevailing market price. And what is the whole procedure for raising commercial paper? So before raising the commercial paper, the packaging company must appoint a scheduled bank as issuing and paying agent. Then it must enter into an issuing and paying agency agreement with the issuing and paying agent, whom I'll call the IPA. And this IPA plays a very important role in monitoring the facility and the issuer, holding all the original documents and checking that the CP issue is in conformity with the applicable laws. Commercial paper issuance is governed by RBI guidelines. There's a detailed RBI circular on this. And there is a provision that if an issuer has defaulted on a commercial repayment or a redemption of a commercial paper, such an issuer will not be allowed to access the CP market for 6 months from the date on which it repaid the defaulted obligation. And as far as documentation is concerned, now FIMDA, which is a Fixed Income Money Market and Derivatives Association of India, has come out with detailed operational guidelines on commercial paper, and they have prescribed simple standard documentation and procedures. So the documentation for commercial paper is very, very simpler amongst different products. I think it's next to ICDs, it's one of the simplest. So these guidelines also give the formats in which documents are to be executed, and normally industry practices, the formats are for this one, formats are sort of followed as is, and you don't see any change in the formats of FIMDA. One important thing in commercial papers is the credit rating, and if the CP issuance is in a calendar year is less than 1,000 crore, then credit rating should be obtained from one rating agency, and if the issuance in a calendar year is more than 1,000, then it has to be from 2 rating agencies, and the lower of the 2 ratings will have to be adopted. The next slide. So I'll now come to the next product, which is leasing and hire purchase. So as you are all aware, leasing and hire purchase is a form of asset financing, and you have different. So I'll speak first about leases. You have different kinds of leases. You'll have a financial lease, you can have an operating lease, you can have a wet lease, you can have a dry lease. And what are the assets that you normally this one procure under leasing and hire purchase? These are generally vehicles, aircraft, construction equipment, IT equipment, office equipment, and even medical equipment. So I will explain financial lease by giving a very simple example. Suppose I am a lessor company and there are contractors for road or building construction who require a crane, and these are these huge cranes. So they have one option: they can go to any lender and take a loan to buy a crane, but in most cases the lender will ask them to put up say 10 to 25% margin, which the contractor may not be in a position to spare. So they have the option of availing a financial lease. So what the contractor will do is he will choose a crane, and that is a particular model, and inform the lessor the name of the dealer, the make and the model of the crane. And once the lessor assesses that, okay, this contractor has a good reputation and is entitled to this lease facility, the lessor will raise a purchase order on the dealer, and the lessor will make the payment to the dealer, and the lessor will also direct the dealer to supply the crane directly to the contractor. Now, in this case, the owner of the crane, though it is supplied to the this lessee, the contractor who's the lessee, and the lessee is going to use it, the owner of the crane in a financial lease is always the lessor, and the user is the lessee. So suppose now just take, for example, this crane costs 1 crore rupees, and I'm leasing out to the contractor for 5 years. So I will take monthly or this quarterly lease rentals from the contractor, and I will try to structure the lease rentals in such a way that I recover my principal cost of the crane, I recover my cost of funding, that is the amount that I had to invest in buying the crane, and I make the cost of leasing will also be recovered, and some profit margin. So all this I will add up to determine what the lease rental is going to be. And at the end, now it's a 5-year financial lease. So at the end of the term of the lease, the lessee will have the right to purchase the equipment at the market value in most cases. And the other option to the lessee is lessee can continue the lease for another term that is agreed between the lessor and the lessee. And the third thing is the lessee can also facilitate the transfer of the asset to a third party. So in financial leases, we try to make different options available to the lessee at the end of the lease term. And in a financial lease, the lessee assumes most of the risks relating to repair, maintenance, and insurance of the asset. So if there's any problem with the asset, it is the lessee who is responsible for insuring the asset. And as far as the asset is concerned, it is recorded in the books of the lessee as its assets. The next slide. So I now come to, I finished explaining what is a financial lease, and I will now come to what is an operating lease. And again, I will go back to my example with the contractor. Suppose this contractor was contractor A, and he did not require this crane for 5 years, but he requires the crane for 3 months from October to December 2020. He does not require it in January 2021. He requires it again in February and March 2021. So it's a waste of money if such a person is either going to buy the crane or lease it out for 5 years. So what is the option available to such a contractor? He can enter into an operating lease arrangement where he leases out the crane only for the 3 months, that is October to December and February and March. So this is an option that is available to him. So how does an operating lease work? The lessor, that is this leasing company, will buy the crane again, and it will lease it out to the contractor for the period from October to December 2020 and for February 2021 to March 2021. In December 2020, the lessee, that is the contractor, will return the crane to the lessor, and the lessor can, for that 1 month, there may be some other contractor who wants to use it for 1 month. So the lessor can lease it out during that 1 month period to somebody else, and after that term ends in March 2021, again the contractor will return the crane to the lessor, and lessor can deploy it wherever they want to any other lessees. So this is the feature of an operating lease. Now you must remember that operating lease will not work if the crane is a special purpose crane which is custom made for a particular project, and such a crane cannot be used for other projects or by other contractors. Operating lease will work only if, in case of general purpose machinery, which can be used by several contractors or several lessees. Now, the feature of an operating lease is that the lease rent from one lessee, like this contractor A, may not cover the entire cost of equipment and return on capital, but only a part of it. So the lessor will have to lease it out to multiple lessees in order to recover the cost of equipment and return on capital. So this is the feature what distinguishes the operating lease from the financial lease. And in the case of the operating lease, the lessor assumes a larger responsibility for repair and maintenance of the asset, and sometimes they also assume the responsibility of insurance. Advantage to a lessee of taking or availing operating lease is that you get access to the latest technology. So, if I buy an equipment and as an owner, I'm stuck with the equipment for 5 years. So after 2 years, there is a more advanced equipment in the market. I do not get the benefit of that. Whereas in an operating lease, I get the benefit of the latest technology. Now, the assets which are under an operating lease are recorded as an asset on the lessor's books. And the lease rentals are also booked as an expense in lessee's books and as an income in lessor's book. And in the case of an operation lease, the tax depreciation is always claimed by the lessor. And lease, whether it is financial lease or an operating lease, is a contract of bailment, and it is covered. The law applicable is Chapter 9 of Indian Contract Act. Now, just to give you an example of what is wet lease and dry lease. Now, in an operating lease, suppose now I am along with the crane, the contractor tells me that, look, I don't have an employee who can operate the crane. So please, along with the crane, give me your employee who will be able to operate the crane, and you be responsible for the maintenance and repairs of the crane as well as insurance. So in that case, it becomes a wet lease where the lessor provides to the lessee not only the crane, but along with the crane, there is a crane operator. Then repairs and maintenance are taken care of by the lessor. Insurance is also taken care of by the lessor. That is called a wet lease. And a dry lease is when I only lease out the equipment without anything else. I just would like to highlight one more feature about leasing, and that is, see, in leasing, the lessor could be claiming the depreciation for tax purpose, in which case they generally pass on the benefit to lessee in terms of lower lease rentals. So in such cases, the lessor must take care that there is no flaw in the documentation that leads to the tax authorities disallowing depreciation. Otherwise, it will be a loss in the transaction for a lessor. Now, as far as financial operating lease, as we discussed earlier, it is always the lessor who's entitled to depreciation. But as far as financial leases are concerned, the Supreme Court has held that depreciation can be claimed by the lessor if the terms of the lease establish that the presumption of ownership is in favor of the lessor. Therefore, one must be very careful in one's lease documentation that the documentation evidences ownership rights of the lessor, and it is not merely a financing arrangement under the garb of lease. So this is very, very important in lease documentation. The next slide. So I come to the next product, which is hire purchase. Hire purchase is a very simple product which most of us have seen very often, and it is very, very akin to a loan. Again, I'll come back to an example. So here what happens is a hire purchaser finance gives a car on hire purchase. Say he gives it to me for 36 months, and I have to pay 36 monthly installments. Hire purchase is very similar to loan. Only in the case of hire purchase, it is the hire purchase financier who's the legal owner of the asset till such time I, as the hirer, pay the last, that is the 36th installment. So till 36th installment is paid by me, hire purchase financier is the owner. The minute I pay the 36th installment, I become the owner of the asset. And as far as the hire purchase installment is concerned, the hire purchase financier will factor the price of the assets along with an interest component, and the installments could be monthly or quarterly. And in case of hire purchase, as the assets are booked in the name of the hirer, that is, it will be in my books, and only the interest component of the hire purchase installment is deductible as an expense for me. And in hire purchase, depreciation is always claimed. Tax depreciation is always claimed by the hirer. The next slide. So I'll now discuss some of the advantages of leasing and hire purchase. So see, one of the main advantages of leasing and hire purchase vis-a-vis secured borrowing is that in leasing and hire purchase, the lessor or the hire purchase financier is the owner of the asset and is entitled to repossess the asset. So when you are the owner of the asset, it is relatively easier to repossess owned assets than to repossess an asset where one is a secured creditor. And secondly, for availing leasing and hire purchase finance, there is relatively less paperwork, and normally the sanction and disbursement of hire purchase facility is much faster than the traditional loan products. But the one negative factor is that hire purchase and leasing tend to be a little costlier as compared to bank finance. What are the factors that you must be careful of as a hire purchase financier or as a lessor? See, there are several instances that we come across of fake invoices and transactions without underlying assets. As I said, hire purchase and leasing, they are asset financing, basically asset funding. So you know what is the good thing about leasing and hire purchases? You have access to good, if the lessee or the hirer defaults, there is a good asset that you have recourse to. So you have to ensure that the asset is there, and that you take care that invoices, purchase order, assets are genuine and the assets are actually installed and delivered. The second thing is you must know the location of the assets properly and the asset identification. If it is a car, you must know the registration number, the engine number, the chassis number, because all these are important at the time of repossession. Another thing in asset is you must monitor the insurance very, very carefully if you don't want to suffer a loss. So these are some of the important things. And one last thing I would like to speak about leasing and hire purchases. Since 1st of September 2016, the rights under a lease and hire purchase can be enforced under SARFAESI also by banks, certain specified notified NBFCs, as well as some financial institutions. Before this amendment on 1st September 2016, provisions of SARFAESI did not apply to hire purchase or lease. So this is one more advantages that a hire purchase financier or a lessor has. So with this, I will conclude on my part, and I will hand it over to Srinivas to explain the nuances of debentures.
Thank you, Sandhya. We'll be going over the nuances of debentures. And before we get into the compliances that are required in terms of various kinds of debentures, let's first take a minute to understand what a debenture is. Now, like all or almost all legal terms, the word debenture has also been derived from a Latin word, which literally means to borrow. Debentures are defined under the Companies Act as debenture includes any debenture, stock, bonds, or any other instrument of a company that evidences a debt, whether it constitutes a charge on the assets or not. So essentially, to speak, a debenture is nothing but a piece of paper. I mean, not if it is a dematerialized, which is now possible, but conceptually, debenture is an instrument which is signed by the authorized officers of the company, which acknowledges the fact that money has been lent and interest has been agreed to be paid. And the debenture may or may not be a secured debenture. That is, it may not create a security over the assets of the company, in which case it will be an unsecured debenture. So let's quickly go over what are the various kinds of debentures, because debenture can be structured in any manner, in any permutation and combination, and depending on in which way it is structured, the regulatory aspects will kick in. Various regulatory aspects will kick in. So let's look at what the classification of the debentures on the from a security standpoint. A debenture can be a secured or an unsecured debentures. A secured debenture, the charge can be created on any movable or immovable assets of the company or any group company for the issuance. And unsecured debentures are also known as naked debentures because of the fact that they are unsecured. There are no assets backing the debentures. They are usually riskier, but to offset that risk, they also carry a slightly higher amount of rate of interest on the debenture. Now, if you are to classify the debentures on the basis of tenure, then you can classify them as redeemable and irredeemable debentures. Redeemable debentures mean that after a particular period of time, the debentures will have to be paid back. The payment can be done over a course of time in equal installments, or it can be by way of a one-shot bullet payment. Typically, secured debentures are not issued for more than 10 years, whereas there is a concept called irredeemable debentures, which are essentially a debt to the company for long term, which is usually only when the company goes into winding up that these debentures are that these debt is actually unwound and paid back. Excuse me. From the perspective of redemption, the debenture can be classified in 2 or 3 different ways. The primary classifications are convertible debentures, non-convertible debentures. Now, convertible debentures, convertible into what? Convertible into equity. So, if you have to get deeper into a convertible debenture can be of 2 kinds. It can be a fully convertible debenture or a partially convertible debenture. Now, assuming it is a convertible debenture, it can also be a compulsorily convertible debenture or an optionally convertible debenture. A compulsorily convertible debenture allows the debenture holder to convert the debenture into equity shares of the company after a predefined period of time. And that is a feature that is built into the debenture itself. In case of an optionally convertible debentures, these are usually dependent on a contingent event such as default, which usually allows banks to convert their, the borrowings, the lendings into equity in the shares of the company because the company is unable to pay. And then you also have a partially convertible debenture, which is a mix of a non-convertible debenture and a convertible debenture. One portion of the debenture is convertible, one portion of the debenture is non-convertible. And from the perspective of free tradability, debentures can be classified as listed and unlisted debentures. If the debentures are listed, it is usually listed in the wholesale debt segment of the stock exchanges. If it is unlisted debentures, it's not listed on any stock exchange. So once we understand these classifications, we can go over what are the regulatory impact on various kinds of debentures. So we've already discussed these. These are the explanations for the kinds of debentures. I can just hover over these for about 15 seconds if you would like to read it. Otherwise, I can just move on to the next slides. So now there are several laws that govern the issuance of debentures, and depending upon what kind of debenture you're issuing, different laws will come into effect. But as a general principle, all debentures will be covered under the Companies Act 2013. And in case you are issuing listed debentures, then SEBI comes into play. So SEBI has a regulation by the name of SEBI Issuance and Listing of Debt Regulations issued in 2008, and that will apply. And once you list anything on any stock exchange, the listing obligations and the disclosure requirements will also apply. So if you have listed debentures, you will have to comply with the SEBI regulations. Now, in case of convertible debentures which are listed, then you will also need to look at SEBI issuance of capital and disclosure requirements. Because of the convertible nature of debentures, they are quasi-equity instruments, and therefore you will also need to comply with any specific terms of this regulation. In addition to these, you also have RBI that regulates the issuance of debentures. Now, for example, if non-convertible debentures of maturity of less than 1 year, which is issued by way of private placement, there is an RBI direction on that, which states to whom you can issue, what is the net worth requirements that you're required to have. We'll go over those in the subsequent slides. And RBI also regulates how FPIs can invest in debt of Indian companies. And there are a set of regulations on concentration of investment in various corporates or within a particular group. And also NBFCs. So RBI regulates NBFCs. So any debentures which are issued by NBFCs is also regulated by RBI. So let's quickly go over the requirements of the Companies Act. pertaining to issuance of debentures. And these are broad things to be borne in mind. So in case of the Companies Act, if you're issuing a convertible debenture, then an approval by special resolution is required. Secured debentures are usually issued for less than 10 years, not more than 10 years in tenure. There are certain exceptions to this, and these are debentures issued by infrastructure companies or infrastructure financing companies. There are about 4 or 5 exceptions. And once you issue a debenture, you will need to create something called a debenture redemption reserve. And this is a notional entry in your books, which is created out of the profits of the company that is available for payment of dividend. And whatever amount you create to this debenture redemption reserve, you cannot use it for anything. The company cannot use it for anything except for repayment of the debentures. Now, there are certain exemptions. Some of the companies do not need to maintain this DRR. And in case you don't fall within the exception, then the adequacy of the DRR is to be 10% of the value of the outstanding debentures. At the end of the year, at the end of the financial year, there is also a requirement to create a deposit of about 15% of the amount of debentures maturing during the year to provide for the redemption of those debentures. Now, when you're issuing debentures, you will also need to be mindful that you don't fall within the definition of a deposit, because there's a thin line between a debenture and a deposit. Now, there are several exceptions to what is not a deposit. So you will need to see that. And one of the salient ones that cover the issuance of debentures is that an unsecured debenture, if it is not listed on a stock exchange, will be treated as a deposit. Or you will need to also see if you fall within the other exceptions. So one of the other exceptions is if any borrowings between two corporates will not be treated as a deposit. So if there's an unsecured debenture issuance which is not listed between two corporates, then essentially you will fall within that exemption. Or if you are issuing NCDs to non-residents under FEMA, those will also not come under the exceptions to the deposit. But you will the short point is you will need to also look at what are the requirements under the deposit provisions under the Companies Act before you undertake an issuance of debentures. Now, any public issuance of debentures or an offer to the public exceeding 500 will not be possible unless you have appointed a debenture trustee. So in such cases, a debenture trustee is a must. Secured debentures will be secured by the creation of charge in favor of the debenture trustee, and these charge can be created on the movable and immovable assets of the company or its subsidiary or the holding company or any of its group companies, and the value of the charge will have to be sufficient for the repayment of the amount of debentures and the interest thereon. Typically, sometimes banks, when they are subscribing to debentures, they will ask you for a slightly higher percentage of coverage to ensure that any depreciation in value will not render the amount insufficient for the payment of the debentures. Now, when you're issuing secured debentures, there is also a requirement that a debenture trust deed will have to be executed, and debenture trust deed will have to be substantially in the same form as is prescribed under Form SH12, and this will have to be executed by the company within 60 days of the allotment of debentures. Now, these are the provisions under the Companies Act. Now, again, on the manner of issuance of debentures, you can have a public issue of debentures. If you are issuing debentures by way of a private placement, then you will need to additionally comply with Section 42 of the Companies Act. And Section 42 of the Companies Act essentially talks about private placement of securities. And in case if you're going under this route, you will need to remember that an offer can be made to not more than 200 persons during a financial year. And out of these, a private placement can be made to a selected group of persons who have been identified by the board, which shall not be more than 50 in number in any financial year. So if you exceed any of these, then this will not be treated as a private placement, and it will in effect be treated as a public offer. So the offer cannot be made to more than 200 people, and the issuance cannot be more than 50 people in any financial year. So this is private placement. Now, for a private placement, a special resolution of the members are required. Now, this will not be required in case your borrowing limits are within the limits that are prescribed under Section 180. And the requirement to allot debentures within 60 days from the receipt of money. If you don't allot within 60 days, you cannot utilize the monies that have been received. On failure to allot, there is an obligation to return the funds to the investors within 15 days. If you don't return it within 15 days, then you will also need to pay interest on the unpaid amounts. Then once the debentures are issued, there has to be a return of allotment that has to be filed within 15 days from the date of the allotment. And this should contain the complete list of all the allottees to whom the debentures have been issued. And lastly, we already spoke about this. Unless allotment is made and the return is filed with the ROC, the company shall not be allowed to utilize any of the monies that have been received through this route of private placement. Now, once we complete the private placement, there are a few forms that will need to be filled with the ROC. One, the first two forms are the forms that are to be filed with the ROC for passing of the special resolution in MGT form MGT 14. And then once the completion of private placement is, once we complete the private placement, then you will have to file a form PAS3 within 15 days from the date of allotment of the NCDs. This PAS3 is essentially the list of allottees to whom the debentures have been issued. This will have to be done within 15 days of allotment. And lastly, if it is a secured debenture, you will also need to file form charge 9, CHG 9 with the ROC after within 30 days of creation of charge. So these are the forms that are required to be filed with the ROC in case of a private placement. Now, moving on to the RBI regulations. So if you're issuing a non-convertible debentures, now mind you, this applies only to issuance of non-convertible debentures, and non-convertible debentures under these regulations are specifically defined as non-convertible debentures with maturity of up to 1 year issued through private placement. Now, this is a very important route for corporates that seek to raise short-term debt because of fewer compliances, and it can be issued relatively quickly. These can be issued to almost anyone. It can be issued to individuals, it can be issued to banks, it can be issued to corporates, it can be issued to NRIs, foreign institutional investors. So the net of persons to whom you can issue it is very wide. But there are certain eligibility criteria that the company will have to fulfill, and those are 3 in number. One is that tangible net worth should not be less than 4 crore as per the latest audited balance sheet. Then the corporate should have been sanctioned working capital limits or term loans by banks or all India financial institutions, and none of those borrowings should have been classified as a non-standard asset by the financial banks or institutions. So it should be standard. It should not be an NPA. There is a credit rating requirement, and a minimum credit rating is of A2, and the maturities for the debentures that are to be issued can range anywhere between 90 days to 1 year. And this whole issuance of these debentures need to be completed within 2 weeks, which is why it is a very preferred mode of raising capital by corporates, because this can be achieved very quickly. And as the Companies Act already prescribes, appointment of a debenture trustee is required to secure the interest of the debenture holders. And in case you are issuing NCDs to foreign portfolio investors, FPIs, one thing needs to be borne in mind, that the minimum maturity has to be at least 1 year. And there is an end-use restriction on investment in real estate business, capital market, and purchase of land. So other than these 3, the NCDs, the proceeds from the NCDs can be used for anything except these. The procedure for issuance is also fairly simple. You will have to comply with the procedures of the prescribed in the Companies Act that we discussed, and SEBI if they are applicable. And there is a requirement of an auditor certificate which certifies compliance of the eligibility norms. And then NCDs can be issued at face value with an coupon interest, or at a discount to face value as a 0 coupon instrument. Now, again, RBI also regulates the NCDs which are issued by NBFCs. So if you are an NBFC, then in addition, there are other guidelines or other compliances that you will have to take care. Now, these will also have to be on a private placement basis, and the maturity will have to be over 1 year. The issuance will be in two separate categories: maximum subscription of less than 1 crore and a minimum subscription of 1 crore and above per investor. Now, in case of the minimum subscription of 1 crore and above, the number of people to whom you can issue it is unlimited. There's no limit. Excuse me. Whereas in case of minimum subscription of 1 crore, less than 1 crore, there is a limit of 200 subscribers for every financial year, and a maximum subscription of less than 1 crore, and it shall be fully secured. The option to create a security in favor of the subscriber will be with the issuer, and the NBFC will only issue debentures for the deployment of funds on its own balance sheet, and not to facilitate any resource request of group entities of parent companies or associates. And there is also a condition that the NBFC shall not use these debentures as security for any subsequent fundings. Now, when we're talking of listing of debentures, then as I mentioned, the SEBI issue and listing of the debt securities regulations come into play. The broad procedure for issuance of debentures under that regulation is that, one, you will have to file an application with the stock exchange for listing, and once the in-principle approval of the stock exchange is required, you will need to appoint a merchant banker, lead merchant bankers, and create a debenture redemption account on the Companies Act. You'll have to obtain a credit rating. You will have to enter into an agreement with the depository for dematerialization of the debentures to be issued, and you will need to upload the draft and the final offer document on the websites of the stock exchange with SEBI. You will need to run an advertisement in an English national newspaper and one Hindi, Hindi newspaper before the issue opening date. The issuer will be free to decide the price and the amount of minimum subscription in consultation with the lead merchant banker, and will have to be disclosed in the offer document. Now, again, as it's there in the private placement regulations, in case of non-receipt of the minimum subscription, all the application monies received will have to be refunded. In case these monies are not refunded, then there is an interest provision that gets triggered. Now, with these, we are done with the broad compliances pertaining to debentures. I'll call upon my colleague to take you through the external commercial borrowings and the compliances in respect there.
Thank you, Srinivas. So before we get into the nuances and the specific compliances that relate to external commercial borrowings, let's first look at how ECB, external commercial borrowing, is defined and where it's defined. So external commercial borrowing is defined under the FEMA, Foreign Exchange Management Borrowing and Lending Regulations 2018. It states ECB means a borrowing by a eligible resident entity from outside India in accordance with the framework decided by the Reserve Bank in consultation with the Government of India. Now, the framework that has been decided for governing ECBs is the Foreign Exchange Management Borrowing and Lending Regulations, and there's also master directions on external commercial borrowings, trade credit, and structured obligations. These are basically the regulations that have to be seen for the compliances with ECBs. Now we'll move on to the next slide. So now the next slide. Now first we'll start with talking about the currencies in which the borrowings can be made. We have two options available. For the first will be borrowing can be in a freely convertible foreign currency or in Indian rupees. Now, the reason we are looking at these first is that most of the compliances in relation to ECBs hinge on the currency in which the borrowing is made. For example, if it's a foreign currency loan, FCCBs and FCEBs, that is foreign currency convertible bonds and foreign currency exchangeable bonds, can be issued, which is not possible in a loan taken in INR. Vice versa, in INR, preference shares can be issued, and also rupee denominated bonds that can be issued overseas, but in case that is not permitted in case of foreign currency loans. In both cases, there's one thing common, that there cannot be any issuance of a fully or compulsorily convertible instrument, as then that may lead to infusion of equity in the company, which is not permitted. The next slide In the next slide, we'll deal with who can actually borrow, who can raise funds through ECBs. Again, here there's a difference between a foreign currency and Indian rupee loans. All entities that are eligible to receive FDI are eligible to borrow under foreign currency. Further, in addition to these entities, port trusts, unit and SEZs, so Small Industries Development Bank of India, Exim Bank of India are also permitted to raise ECBs in foreign currencies. In case of an ECB in INR, all entities that are eligible to raise FCY, that is foreign currency loan, foreign currency, are permitted. And in addition to these, entities engaged in microfinance activities which are registered, such as non-profit organizations, registered corporates, cooperatives, societies, etc. These are also permitted to raise funds in INR. Now we'll move on to who the recognized lender is. Can we move on to the next slide, please? Yeah. So a recognized lender, now here the recognized lender has to be, this criteria has to be is same in foreign currency as well as Indian currency. It's common irrespective of the currency of the borrowing. The lender should be a resident of a FATF or an IOSCO compliant country. FATF is Financial Action Task Force, or IOSCO is International Organization of Securities Commission. So if a lender is a resident of these two compliant countries, then the lender is qualified as a recognized lender. What an IOSCO compliant country and an FATF compliant country has been elaborated on in the master directions. So we'll not get into the details of that, but the master directions also specify what these compliant countries mean. Also, if a loan is proposed to be taken from an individual, it can only be done when an individual if the individual is a foreign equity holder, or if it is for subscription of debentures or bonds that are to be listed abroad. If either of these two are satisfied, only then individuals can lend through this ECB mode, otherwise they cannot. We'll move on to the next slide, which where we'll look at what the definition of foreign equity holder is. Now, this is an important definition because when we later come to seeing the minimum average maturity period, there is a different minimum average maturity period specified for a loan taken from a foreign equity holder, and if a loan is taken from somebody else, the MAMP is different. Now, foreign equity holder means a direct foreign equity holder with minimum 25% direct holding in the borrowing company. And it can mean an indirect equity holder with minimum indirect equity holding of 51%. Or it can mean a group company with a common overseas parent. Now, the term group company also has not been defined in the lending and borrowing or lending regulations or the master directions. It has been defined in the FEMA Non-Debt Instrument Rules 2019. So for the definition of group company, we can always refer to the FEMA NDI rules and get clarity on what it means. Now, moving on to the next slide, we look at what can be the minimum average maturity period in case of an ECB. Yeah, so generally the minimum average maturity period is 3 years, but for specific categories, the minimum average different minimum average maturity period has been set out. For example, in case of a loan by a manufacturing company up to 50%, 50 million USD in a financial year, the minimum average maturity period is 1 year. Further, now here is where the foreign equity holder definition comes into play. If ECB is availed from a foreign equity holder for these specific purposes like working capital purpose, general corporate purpose, or repayment of rupee loans, then the minimum average maturity period is 5 years. If when we look at if you look at the 4.4, if the loan is availed from any person other than a foreign equity holder for these specific purposes like working capital, general corporate, or repayment of rupee loans, the minimum average maturity period goes up to 10 years. So this is the difference. If we take loans for these purposes from a foreign equity holder, it can be the MAMP is 5 years, but if it's from any other person, the MAMP is specified as for 10 years. Moving on to the next slide, we will look at the end use provisions. So here basically the end use is like a negative list for which proceeds of the ECB cannot be utilized for. The restrictions are it cannot be utilized for real estate activities, it cannot be utilized for investment in capital market, equity investment, and for working capital purpose, general corporate purpose, reporting, repayment of rupee loans, and on lending, it can you have to see the minimum provisions regarding minimum average maturity period, which we saw in the previous slide, and only in as specified there, the proceeds can be utilized for these purposes. After this, the next slide that we'll be taking a look at is all-in cost and the limits for borrowings. All-in cost is something that has to be mutually agreed between the parties. It includes rate of interest, fees, and other expenses that are to be paid in respect of the loan. One thing that all-in cost does not include is prepayment charges or penal interest for breach of any covenants of the borrowing. So if there's any prepayment charge that is envisaged, or there is any penal interest that is specified for breach of covenants of the agreement, it will not be a part of the all-in cost ceiling. It will be outside the all-in cost ceiling, and it cannot be more than 2% of the overall contracted rate of interest that is decided on the outstanding principal amount. Now the all-in cost ceiling is, the specified ceiling is benchmark rate plus 450 basis points spread. Now, what is a benchmark rate differs from the differs depending on the currency of the borrowing. If the borrowing is in foreign currency, it can be LIBOR or Euribor or any other interbank 6-month interbank interest rate. For a borrowing in INR, it is the benchmark rate prevailing at the time of government benchmark rate prevailing for a government security of the same maturity period. Now, the limit that is specified in a financial year for borrowings under automatic route is 750 million USDs or its equivalent. In case of a startups, the limit is 3 million USD or its equivalent per financial year. Another point that has to be kept in mind that if it is raised from a direct foreign equity holder. Now, the word used here is direct foreign equity holder and not just a foreign equity holder. So if it's from a indirect foreign equity holder or a group company with common overseas parent, this does not have to be complied with. That is, the ECB liability ratio cannot exceed 7:1. Now we move on to the reporting requirements that are there that have to be complied with for at the time of raising of ECB. Now there are two forms that have to be filed that are specified for ECBs. There is one from ECB and there's one from ECB2. Now there's a concept of a loan registration number which has to be LRN, which has to be taken. So before any drawdown is made in respect of a ECB, form ECB has to be filed with the relevant AD bank. The AD bank, this has to be filed in duplicate. It generally contains the terms and conditions of the external commercial borrowing, and the AD bank after verifying all the details and everything, issues a loan registration number, only after which any drawdown is permitted to be made. Now, if there are any changes in the terms, then it again has to be reported in form ECB, and that has to be done within 7 days of the change becoming effective. There is another form ECB2 which has to be filed on a monthly basis. Now this has to be filed within 7 days of the close of the month, and any delay in filing of these two forms late submission fee will have to be paid. This has been specified by RBI. So according to that, if there's any delay in filing of these forms, either of these forms, a late submission fee has to be paid to make up for that delay. Moving on to the next slide, we'll look at securities. Now an ECB can be raised with or without security. In case if we want to, there's a security that is proposed to be given in terms of the ECB, then the securities can be on immovable assets, movable assets, financial securities, and there can be any personal or corporate guarantee also that can be given. Now there are certain general conditions that the AD banker has to satisfy himself of, that these conditions have been specified before allowing creation or cancellation of charge on any of the mentioned assets. Now these are a couple of, one is that if there is an existing lender, then an NOC from the existing lender has to be obtained for creation of a charge. Also, the other underlying ECB guidelines and all the term compliances are made, and no default has been made in respect of that. One more condition is that there is in the loan agreement, there has to be specifically a security clause which says that a security can be created or cancelled, and if this clause is not there in the loan agreement, then the AD banker can reject the request for making a security. Now there are specific conditions as well for each of these creation of these securities for each of these mentioned assets. We'll not get into the details of those now, but we also have to keep in mind that there are, in addition to these general conditions, there are specific conditions as well that will have to be looked at and complied. Moving on, now we'll look at the borrowings, whether the borrowings by raising of ECBs can be made by entities that are under investigation. That will be on the next slide. If an entity is under investigation for violation of provisions relating to FEMA, or any adjudication is pending with respect to that, or any appeal is pending in respect to that, then also the entity can raise external money through external commercial borrowings if it is otherwise eligible to raise the ECBs. So irrespective of this adjudication that is going on, investigation that is going on, the ECB can be raised. Now it is the borrower's it is the borrower's responsibility that it informs the AD bank or RBI that such investigation is pending or adjudication is pending. And when the RBI or the AD bank approves this proposal, it will send an intimation to the relevant agency who's conducting the investigation or before which such adjudication or appeal is pending, informing them of this approval and this ECB that this entity has raised. Now I am done with my part, and if there are any questions, we can please type them in the comments box and we'll take them up. I hand over to Atul to take us to the compliances that are required under Companies Act. Thank you.
Thank you, Shahbaz. Good evening, everyone. Next slide, please. So I'll be covering 3 topics today. Firstly, I'll be covering certain Companies Act compliances pertaining to the borrowings by a public limited company and a private limited company. Next topic will be certain compliances pertaining to intercorporate deposits. And the last topic of the day would be the fixed deposit compliances. So coming to the first topic of the day, borrowings. Borrowings has always been a critical source of finance for any company. Generally, a company has 2 sources of financing, internal source of finance and external source of finance. When talking about internal source of finance, a public company or a private company can raise money by issuing equity or taking deposit from employees, taking deposit from members, taking deposit from public. And when we talk about external source of funding, they can raise money from banks, financial institutions, venture capitalists, and angel investors. So before any company proceeds with the process of borrowing money, there are certain Companies Act sections or the compliances which needs to be taken care of. One of the section of the Companies Act is 179 subsection 3, which talks about powers of the board of directors, and that the director shall exercise certain powers, which includes, one of the power is to borrow money on behalf of the company and by means of passing a board resolution at a board convened meeting. So what is section 179? As per section 179, the power to borrow money may be delegated by the board to a certain committee of directors for such delegation at a duly convened board meeting, or to the managing director, or in case the company has manager, then to the manager, or to the principal officer of the company, or in the case of branch office of the company, then the principal officer of the branch office of the company. So once the board passes the resolution pursuant to section 179 subsection 3 clause D, the company is to file a copy of the resolution with an e-form called MGT 14 with the Registrar of Companies within 30 days of passing of such resolution. Next comes section 180, which talks about restriction on the powers of the board of directors. Now, this provision of this section prohibits the board of directors of a company from borrowing a sum which, along with together with the money already being borrowed by the company, exceeding the aggregate of the paid up share capital, security premium account, free reserves, apart from the temporary loans which has already been borrowed from the company's bankers in the ordinary course of the business, unless the company has received a prior approval from a shareholders by passing a special resolution in a general meeting. So to summarize it, a company can still borrow along with the money already being borrowed, exceeding the aggregate, that is exceeding the limit which is prescribed in section 180, after taking a prior approval from shareholders by passing a special resolution in a general meeting. Moving on to the next slide, please. Now, the term temporary loans, as mentioned in section 180, has been expressively mentioned under the Act, which means that the loans which are repayable on demand or within 6 months from the date of the loan, such as short-term cash credit arrangements, the discounting of the bills, and the issue of other short-term loans of seasonal character, but does not include loan raised for the purpose of financial expenditure of a capital nature. So generally, a company, by passing a special resolution, always set a limit up to which a company can borrow. However, if the board wishes to go beyond that limit, they can still do so, but without a prior approval of shareholders, they can still do so. But they have to again set a new fixed limit for the maximum cap up to which a company can borrow. Now, in this pertaining to section 179 and 180, there are certain exemptions which are given to the private companies. Currently, all companies are required to file a copy of resolution, that is an MGT 14, which is passed by the board of directors in respect of the matters which are listed down in section 179, in which one of the power is to borrow money, with ROC within 30 days of passing of such resolution. But in case of private limited company, the exemption has been given to them. So the private limited companies are not required to file the copies of resolution with ROC. Second is, private companies are exempted from the requirement of section 180 of the Companies Act via MCA notification dated 2015. This means that a private company to borrow money exceeding the limit as prescribed under section 180, they can do so without taking prior approval of shareholders in a general meeting. Moving on to the next slide, please. Now, coming to the next topic, that is intercorporate deposit. Let us first understand the meaning of intercorporate deposit, which is commonly known as ICDs also. Now, an intercorporate deposit is an unsecured borrowing from one corporate to another corporate who are registered under the Companies Act 2013 or who are registered under the erstwhile Companies Act 1956. Usually in these cases, the corporates who have surplus funds lends to another corporates who are in need of funds. Now, a point to be noted here is that then intercorporate deposits are exempt from the definition of the deposit as given under the Deposit Rule 2014. So the provision of deposit and the deposit rule will not apply to intercorporate deposit or to any other companies who are issuing ICDs. Hence, in these cases, companies need to consider the applicability of section 186, which talks about loans and investment by a company. Now, let us see what are the restrictions under section 186. Now, section 186 says that unless a company has been given authorization via shareholders by passing a special resolution, no company shall directly or indirectly give any loan to any person or to any body corporate, give any guarantee or provide security in connection with any loan to any other body corporate, acquire by way of subscription, purchase or otherwise the securities of any other body corporate exceeding 60% of its paid up share capital, free reserve, security premium account, or 100% of the free reserves, security premium account, whichever is higher. Now, as per section 186, this limit is not applicable to a transaction which is happening between a holding company or a wholly owned subsidiary company or a joint venture company. Moving on to next slide. Now, there are certain compliances which the company needs to take care when they are pursuing with section 186, such as the approval of the board is required in all the cases, irrespective of the amount of loan, investment, guarantee, or security. Now, the approval of the board shall be obtained by means of passing a board resolution, which needs to be a unanimous resolution. That means with the consent of all the directors present at the meeting. The company shall have to obtain the prior approval of PFI from which it has taken a loan. However, the approval of public financial institution is not required if the amount of loan does not exceed the limit which is as prescribed in section 186. The rate of interest chargeable should be more than prevailing yield of government security closest to the period of tenure of the loan. Now, the company needs to disclose certain information to the members, and they can do so only via publishing financial statements, such as the purpose for which the loan has been given, the purpose for which the investment or the security has been made, and all the full particulars of the loan's investment and the security. Now, every company which makes a loan, investment, or security shall maintain a register, and in that register, all the information and particular needs to be discharged. For example, the register has to be maintained in form MBP2. Now, no loan by defaulter company. This means that a company which has defaulted in repayment of any deposit or repayment of any interest thereon shall not make any loan, shall not make any guarantee, shall not provide any security in connection with the loan unless until the default is subsisting. So, or the default has been made good and a period of 5 years has been elapsed. Now, there are certain situations where an intercorporate deposit or a loan has been made by one company to another company, but in such situation, there are certain common directors or certain directors are interested in both the companies. So in that case, section 185 of the Companies Act, which talks about loans given to the companies in which directors are interested, needs to be complied with. So there are certain additional compliances under section 185, which also needs to be complied with when there are certain common directors in both the entities. Now moving to the next slide. Coming to the last topic of the day, which is fixed deposit. Now, Companies Act 2013 initially laid down certain prohibition for acceptance of deposit, which were later relaxed through various amendments made by MCA and providing crucial exemption to private companies. Now, private companies can now still accept deposit from its members with minimum regulatory compliances. Now, before moving towards the regulatory compliances and requirement for accepting deposits by the company, it must be clear what is a deposit first and what are excluded from the ambit of a deposit and not termed as deposit. Now, the governing sections which regulates the accepting repayment of deposits by companies are section 73 to 76, which needs to be read with companies acceptance of deposit rules 2014. So before we proceed with the deposit rules and deposit compliances, let us take a look at the definition of deposit and certain other definitions such as eligible companies. Now, what is a deposit? Deposit has been defined under section 2 clause 31 of the Companies Act 2013, further expanded in the deposit rules. Now, the term deposit states that deposit includes any receipt of money by way of deposit or loan or in any other form by a company, but does not include such categories of amount as may be prescribed in consultation with the Reserve Bank of India. Now, these deposit rules are not applicable to certain companies. These are exemption from the given to the banking companies or an NBFC which is registered with Reserve Bank of India, or to any other such companies as the central government may, after consultation with RBI, specify in this behalf. Now, deposit rules also defines eligible company. Now, what is an eligible company? It's a public company which has a minimum net worth of 100 CR or turnover of rupees 500 CR and which has obtained a prior approval or prior consent of the shareholders in a general meeting by means of passing a special resolution and also filed the said resolution with the ROC before making any invitation to the public for acceptance of deposits. Moving on to the next slide. Now, there is a difference between a loan and a deposit. A deposit includes a loan, but not every loan may be a deposit. There are certain amounts which do not fall within the ambit of definition of deposit as given in deposit rules or as given under the Companies Act 2013. Some of the important are loans which are taken by company from another company, loans from director or relative of a director, subject to a declaration that the amounts are not being funded by borrowing or accepting loans or depositing from others, and such other companies disclosing the same in the board's report. Loans which are received by foreign government, foreign or international banks, multilateral financial institutions, foreign collaborators, foreign body corporate, and foreign citizens, or a person resident outside India. But these are all subject to the FEMA provisions. Next is amount which is bought in by promoters or as unsecured loan in stipulation of any lending financial institutions or banks, subject to loan is bought in pursuance of stipulation imposed by lending institution on promoters to contribute such finance, and loan is provided by the promoters themselves or by the relatives of the promoters. And one of the exemption is that exemption is available only till the loans are repaid and not thereafter. Next could be amount received, again commercial papers, etc. And there are other also amounts which are mentioned in deposit rules, rule 2 sub rule C of the deposit rules. Next slide please. Now a public company can accept deposit from its members and public provided they fulfill certain conditions, which is mentioned in section 73 subsection 2 from clause A to E of the Companies Act. Some of the compliances requirements are the company needs to obtain the approval of shareholders in general meeting through passing a ordinary resolution. A circular needs to be issued by the company for inviting deposits to all its members, which would contain a statement showing the financial position of the company, the credit rating of the company, the total number of depositors, and the amount due towards deposit in respect of any previous deposits any company has accepted. Filing that copy of the circular along with statement with the ROC before the date of issue of the circular. Depositing at least 20% of the amount of his deposit maturing during the following financial year or on before 30th April of each year, and such amount shall be kept in a different account, which is commonly known as deposit repayment reserve account. The company must certify that the company has not defaulted in any repayment of deposit or payment of interest thereon, and if the default had already been occurred, then the default was made good and 5 years had elapsed from the date of making such default good. Company also needs to execute the execute deposit trust deed in form DPT2 at least 7 days before issuing the circular. Interest rate and brokerage thereon should be at maximum rate of interest or brokerage prescribed by RBI in case the company is accepting the deposit from NBFC. Lastly, the company needs to furnish receipt within 21 days of amount received to the depositor. Moving on to the next slide. Now we are going to talk about the ceiling limit for accepting the deposits. Now an eligible company from its members can accept deposit to the extent of 10% of its paid up share capital, security premium account, free reserves along with the existing deposit. Other than the eligible company, that is any other public company can accept deposit from its members only to the extent of 35% of its paid up share capital, security premium account and free reserves. Now in case of accepting deposits from public, an eligible company can accept deposit from public to the extent of 25% of its paid up share capital, security premium account, free reserves along with the existing deposit. A government company shall not accept or renew any deposit if the total deposit exceeds 35% of the paid up share capital, free reserves and security premium account. Public company other than eligible company is strictly prohibited to accept any or invite deposits from public. Now there are two important conditions which needs to be taken care of when the company is accepting deposit from public. First is to obtain mandatory credit rating, which would include its net worth, liquidity, ability to pay its debt on due date at the time of invitation of deposits from the public, and which needs to be obtained every year during the tenure of the deposit. Second point would be for securing the deposit. In case of unsecured deposit, a charge needs to be created on an asset of the company, which should not be not less than the amount of a deposit accepted within 30 days from the date of such acceptance in accordance with the deposit rule 2014. Moving on to the next slide. Now in case of private companies accepting deposit from members, there are two situations. Situation first, where private companies can only accept deposit from its members up to an extent of 100% of aggregate paid up share capital, security premium account and free reserves. Situation 2 talks about when the private company wants to go beyond the limit, as that is 100% of the aggregate paid up share capital, security premium account, free reserves, they can still do so. There are certain categories of private companies which can do so. Let's have a look at all those private companies which can exceed the limit of situation 1. Now, certain class of private companies can still accept deposit exceeding 100%, such as private company which is a startup for 5 years from the date of its incorporation, a private company which fulfills certain condition, for example, which is not an associate or subsidiary company of any other company, the borrowing of that such company from banks or financial institution or any other body corporate is less than twice of its paid up share capital or 50 crores, whichever is less. Such a company has not defaulted in the repayment of such borrowings subsisting at the time of accepting deposit, as mentioned under section 73 of the Companies Act. Now, all these companies who are accepting the deposit from members, from public, they need to file the details of the money in an e-form called DPT3 with the ROC. Lastly, private companies are prohibited from accepting or inviting any deposit from general public. However, it can still accept deposit from members, from employees, from relatives of directors, etc. So here I conclude my presentation. Thank you, everyone. Over to Mr. Srinivas for Q&A session.
Thank you, Atul. Just collating a list of the questions, and we have received over 107 questions. We will not be able to pick up all of the questions right now. What we'll do is we'll take the first few questions, and we will respond to the other questions over email in the coming days. So this question is to Sandhya. Is factoring facility shown as a working capital borrowing on the books of the company availing the facility?
Yeah, so factoring facility, it all depends on whether you're factoring. As I explained, factoring facility can be with recourse or without recourse. So if a company avails factoring facility which is with recourse, that is, the factor can, if the debtor defaults, the factor can recover the money from the borrowing company, then in that case it's with recourse, it has to be shown as a borrowing. But if it is a without recourse facility, then it goes out of the books of the company which is raising the money, and in that case it never shows it as a borrowing.
Okay, thank you, Sandhya. The next question is whether the advance taken from customers by real estate companies on which no interest has been paid, whether this will be treated as an advance or deposit under the Companies Act. This will be to Atul.
See, if we see the deposit rules, the point mentioned in the deposit rule is that when the money is received in the course or for the purpose of the business of the company as advance, which is received in connection with the consideration for the property under an arrangement or under an agreement, then it is exempted from the definition of deposit. So the money taken from customers by a real estate company shall not be considered as deposit unless if it is not adjusted against the property in accordance with the terms of arrangement or agreement, then it will be treated as deposit.
Thanks, Atul. The next question is what is the stamp duty to be paid on debentures? So I think, yeah, okay. So on debentures, this is a very valid question because the Indian Stamp Act amendments have been brought out recently, and they're supposed to be notified on, and they're supposed to come into force on 1st of July 2020. It was to come into force on April 1st, but this got delayed because of COVID and other problems. So under the old Stamp Act, in the Indian Stamp Act, only marketable debentures had to be stamped. And the cap of stamp duty was about 25 lakhs, and the rate of stamp duty was an ad valorem duty of about 0.05%. 0.05%. But now under the new the amendments to the Indian Stamp Act, the distinction between marketable and non-marketable securities, all that is gone, and now any debenture will have to be stamped. And but the good thing is the rate of stamp duty has come down. There is no cap. The rate of stamp duty is now 0.005%. So the stamp duty is lower, but the problem is any debenture now will get will attract stamp duty. So let's look at the next question. How is the late submission fee for Form ECB calculated? So ECB Shehbaz.
Yeah, so the master directions have specified this calculation and how it has to be calculated. So there's different late filing fee, late submission fee for an ECB and for Form ECB2. In case of Form ECB, if the delay is of filing is up to 3 years, then the fee would be INR 50,000 per year. And if the delay goes beyond 3 years, then the fee is INR 1 lakh per year.
Okay, so we've got several other questions, and as I mentioned that we'll address these questions over email in the coming days. So with this, I'd like to conclude the webinar, and I'd like to thank all of you who have registered and attended the webinar. Although this was scheduled for an hour, I think we far exceeded our time, and we thank you for everyone's patience. And I'd also like to thank all the panelists who have participated in the knowledge sharing session. And I'd also like to bring your attention to our subsequent webinars that are going to be over the next couple of weeks. And these webinars will primarily pertain to ESOPs, legal and tax issues. They will pertain to the area of IBC, especially around the suspension of IBC and the gray areas which are still yet to be ironed out in IBC. So these are all some of the webinars that you can look forward to. You will find the link and the schedule of webinars on our LinkedIn website, LinkedIn page of Vash Associates. So we urge you to go to the page, look at the future schedule, and join the upcoming webinars. And we'll hope to see. Thanks everyone, and have a good evening.
Thank you.
Thank you for attending.
Thank you.